motivations that have been identified by Baumeister and Pansep. The dominance, which behavior can be observed particularly among inter-male violent behavior, is to a large extent linked to hormones, testosterone to be in particular, and how they drive male or brain activity. Sadism is another typical part of violent behavior. Again, this takes part very deep inside the brain, where our pleasure systems happen to be very closely located to the systems that respond to fear and rage. And for apparently some human beings, these things can actually literally get mixed up. So humans have different motivations to be violent. Some of them are very immediate and respond directly to an external drive. Others are driven hormonal. And finally, some of them are much more reflective, much more rational, and trying to achieve something. How can we think about that as linked to social behavior? Humans are clearly social beings. We interact and we survive in groups. And the need to be protected within the group, but also to be recognized within the group, are important to understand our actions within group behavior, and possibly also our actions of violent or non-violent behavior. The individual motivations, drives towards conflict, as well as to controlling conflict, have analogies, have linkages towards social behavior. It's important in this respect to understand that humans are clearly social beings. It's important for us to be accepted by a group, to have protection from a group, but it's also important for us to be recognized as within the group. We derive status from our position within the group. So this motivates to a large extent our behavior within the group, and also how we look upon our own behavior towards other people. Interestingly, therefore, the notions of the seeking system can be linked to something that is called the moralizing gap, which can be seen as a form of social bargaining. In contrast, fear and rage can be seen as the willingness of groups of people to escalate conflict. Again, to respond very immediately to the threat, perceived threat from the outside. Let's first talk a bit about the moralizing gap. From experimental research, it has been shown that humans have a very interesting and a very particular way of thinking about conflictuous and talking about conflictuous situations. If in experiments people were given a particular situation to look at, and then were asked to retell what they observed from the perspective of the perpetrator of the violence, as well as the perspective of the victim of the violence, and then finally even as the outsider. And as it turns out, there are very distinct patterns that we use to talk about the violent conflict. These conflicts cannot just be observed third hand, but also in just asking perpetrators of violence and victims of violence to retell their experiences. So what do we observe? From the perspective of the perpetrator, there tends to be a tendency to go towards the harmful act. That's where the story started. I did something violent to the other person. It becomes very important to justify this, to provide the reasons for the violence. Violence is never simply happening, it happens because of a particular reason. The person, even the perpetrator, may accept that what he or she did was ultimately wrong, but there was a reason behind it. It may have been a reaction to something, it may have been a response, whatever you call it. In this way, it somewhat absolves the person from the blame. It allows the other people to understand, to put themselves in the position of the person who acted violently. There's also a tendency to argue that whatever harm was done was rather temporary and possibly minor. The idea is, I did something that was wrong, possibly, but you could understand why I did it. I'm willing to apologize for it. Let's move on. From the perspective of the victim, the story plays out quite differently.